administration that seems to get lost in its own fog of chaos and dysfunction when it comes to everything from immigration policy to the president's internal battleground state polls. There may be no chapter quite as terrifying as watching Donald Trump march to the beat of his own drums of war with Iran. After making a series of moves seen around the world as escalating an already fraught situation with Iran, Donald Trump now finds himself largely checkmated on two intractable fronts, Iran and North Korea. The New York Times' David Sanger today writing this, quote, after coming to office vowing to solve two very different nuclear crises, President Trump finds himself in a bind, familiar to his predecessors, careening toward a confrontation with Iran and stalemated with North Korea. Trump on Monday dispatching 1,000 more troops to the Middle East as part of his escalation with Iran. But in a sign of policy schizophrenia, his Secretary of State out today with a more dove-like message.
We are there to deter aggression. President Trump does not want war, and we will continue to communicate that message while doing the things that are necessary to protect American interests in the region.
The policy whiplash more disorienting than comforting, particularly as Trump's abject failure to halt North Korea's pursuit of a nuclear weapon is on full display, as he sounds more like a devoted schoolboy with a crush on the brutal dictator of North Korea than a serious consumer of U.S. intelligence community assessments that Kim Jong-un is undeterred in his pursuit of a nuclear arsenal. Here's the president when asked about the intelligence community assessments.
You think he's still building nuclear weapons?
I don't know. I hope not. He promised me he wouldn't be. He promised me he wouldn't be testing.
So you still trust him?
Well, look, I couldn't tell you that. It would be very insulting to him. But the answer is, yeah, I believe that he would like to do something. I believe he respects me. I get along with him really well. I think I understand him, and I think he understands me.
That's nice. We're way past love letters, folks, but it is the constant churn of chaos that surrounds everything from Trump's Twitter pronouncements to his aides' contradictory public statements to the abrupt changes in personnel that leave the world on edge. From the New York Times, quote, caught in the middle, the Europeans have been reduced to calling for restraint and de-escalation, while both Washington and Tehran seem set on raising tensions, risking a conflict that by accident or design could burn the Middle East and disrupt the world's energy supplies. And adding to the upheaval, Trump today switching horses at the Pentagon. His acting defense secretary, Patrick Shanahan, stepping down and withdrawing from consideration to become the permanent defense secretary. Trump today naming an acting replacement, Army Secretary Mark Esper, which leaves his Department of Defense without a permanent leader, as some of our most delicate global conflicts escalate. That upheaval is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Joining us from the Washington Post, national political reporter Robert Costa, plus retired four-star general Barry McCaffrey, who's also an MSNBC military analyst, lucky for us. With us on set, Eugene Robinson, Washington Post columnist, Republican strategist Rick Wilson's back, and the host of Saturday Night Politics here on MSNBC, Donny Deutsch, is here. General McCaffrey, let me start with you. This picture of constant gyrations around the deliberations around Iran seems to be fulfilling the old expression, when America sneezes, the world catches a cold.
Well, you know, Nicolle, I've followed these foreign policy and national security policy issues for the better part of 50 years. You almost have to be at a loss for words as to what's going on. Probably the single biggest problem is we have no structure in government left. In the Pentagon, the Homeland Security Office, the White House, except for Ivanka and Jared and Bolton, it's hard to know whose voice is being listened to, with an impulsive, badly educated president tweeting out U.S. foreign policy. The second problem is we've lost most of our allies. They have no idea what we're doing. They get publicly insulted. Even people like the Saudis, the Gulf Coast states, and the president said in the Time magazine interview, look, we're not worried about oil. He sort of hung out to dry the Japanese, the Gulf Coast states, the Europeans, who do worry about oil. So there's no coherence to what we're doing. We're operating on a whim.
Well, let me ask you about that whim, General. A former senior intelligence official posed this question today, said the question for policymakers is, will we, by miscalculation or design, find ourselves in an asymmetric confrontation when the Iranian ability to respond in the theater seems disproportionately stronger? I guess the feeling is that all these utterances from Pompeo about how Trump doesn't want war may or may not be true, but the chaos that you described, the dysfunction, the lack of voices that can be trusted other than the president's daughter and son-in-law, who lack the kind of clearance that would let them see the most sensitive intelligence available to national security policy makers, may have us stumbling towards something unintended. Do you think that's a realistic scenario?
I think at the end of the day, there isn't going to be a regional war in the Middle East. I don't believe it. I think it would be appalling damage to the Iranians. By the way, we can sink most of the IRGC naval forces within 48 hours. The combat power to do that is there. What we can't do, I might add, is have any impact on Iranian nuclear development with U.S. military strikes. That's not doable. So I don't think the Saudis, the Gulf Coast states, the Israelis, or the U.S. actually want a conflict. There is a huge possibility of miscalculation. If the IGRC goes after the U.S. Navy or closes the Gulf, I will assume there's a 100% likelihood we'll take military action. It's going to be an ugly war in the Persian Gulf if that happens.
General, John Brennan said on this program a while ago about the way the North Koreans were dealing with Trump that it was clear that he was a leader who could be duped. What lessons do you think the Iranians have taken from the kinds of utterances we just played about Donald Trump, either oblivious or disdainful toward the intelligence community's assessment about both the nature of the North Korean regime and their ambitions to obtain a nuclear arsenal?
I have no idea what our adversaries or our allies have trying to understand what's going on in the United States government. It's just literally without precedent. It's impulsive. It's chaotic. It's stupid frequently. It's contradictory all the time. There's no process to our policy deliberations. I mean, when you get to the North Koreans, for God's sakes, this is one of the most brutal dictatorships in the face of the earth. They are continuing to make fissile material. They are continuing to work on an ICBM prototype. They do have IRBM capability to strike U.S. forces or the Japanese or the South Koreans in the region. So there's an element of fantasy to dealing with the White House. And I bet they're concerned also. I'll bet the Russians are worried inside Moscow. They tend to be very logical and structured in their thinking and risk adverse normally. Putin, I think, says, hey, this guy won't respond to me. There's no limits on our behavior. This is not a good situation.
You took us to Russia, General, so I'm going to stay there. The president, for, I believe, the third day in a row, rapidly responding to his own cyber command, batting down a story that any other White House, Democratic or Republican, would hold up as good news as long as it didn't threaten sources and methods. News over the weekend reported in the New York Times that the U.S. was on some sort of offensive posture in terms of our cyber tactics and tools against Russia's power grid. The president calling that report itself treasonous, even though the reporters who wrote that story had a paragraph in it saying that there were no national security concerns with its publication. The president now on day 2, news cycle 3 of attacking that story, its reporters, and saying it is not true that we are on offense against Russia. Why would that be?
Well, I think actually the NSA, by the way, at the end of the day, 90% of the global offensive capacity in cyber warfare is either the United States or the UK acting in concert. We have an enormous capability. We're not using it to boot against the Russians. We're in there doing reconnaissance and undoubtedly preparing to take action if needed to do so. I think what got the president's goat in that reporting was the notion that we're not telling him the mechanics and the details of what we're up to for fear he will blurt it out to our adversaries, which I think is quite possible. So again, the Russians were not taking offensive actions against them. But I think they wanted that story out, the NSA and the National Security Council, because they wanted to put the Russians on notice, hey, you better stop screwing with our elections here and in Europe.
And Robert Costa, I would say that you have your ear to the ground for Trump's GOP better than anybody. And I'm thinking of Bob Corker, and I can't, off the top of my head, think of really anybody else that said out loud was what you must hear all the time, which is that to the degree that whether it's the Access Hollywood tape or Charlottesville, that Trump is unacceptable. It's these foreign policy gaffes that are the most troubling. What are you hearing about these sort of triple stories, the threat of the upheaval at the Pentagon, the sort of changing posture vis-a-vis Iran with the troop deployment, but the Pompeo statement obviously sending a very different message tonally at least, and the constant doubling and tripling down in favor of Kim Jong-un?
In conversation with top administration officials and Republicans this afternoon, my impression, my notebook tells me that this dynamic, the current dynamic on American foreign policy, is unlikely to change. Acting Secretary Shanahan bowing out means the administration, under pressure from Senate Republicans, is likely to nominate, if anyone, someone who has a low-key persona, like Veterans Affairs Secretary Mr. Wilkie. At the same time, you have Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, has a real grip over foreign policy, along with Jared Kushner and National Security Advisor John Bolton. And that dynamic is going to continue. The idea of bringing in new hands, like Secretary Mattis was, who had a real counter view to how the president thinks, is unlikely at this point.
Robert Costa, I take your point, but I wonder if the fact that Pompeo and Bolton are not even performing as Pompeo and Bolton anymore. They're simply the tail following the dog around. I mean, Pompeo goes out and responds to whatever Trump has tweeted, and Pompeo and Bolton have a body of public utterances and well-known positions on Iran and North Korea that are completely at odds with Donald Trump's impulses and utterances.
But they're playing a long game. When you talk to people who know the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, they point to not only what's happening with Iran, but what's happening in Venezuela. And the hawks continue to circle this president, urging him toward action, if not taking action. They know the president, at the end of the day, has to decide on military intervention or not. But they're in his ear, making the case for possible intervention. And when it comes to engaging with autocrats, they are, on a personal level, not in favor of that policy, but they want to be in the power structure. They want to be close to President Trump, so they're not fighting him on that front.
It is, Rick Wilson, of many deals with the devil, the ones made by the foreign policy folks are the most stark in some ways.
The big mistake they've made in the Republican foreign policy establishment is to think for a moment that Donald Trump has any underpinning of the things that built the global security order since the end of World War II. And he doesn't. It's all transactional. It's all impulsive. It's all, does he like me or does he not like me?
Right.
Can I build a golf course there, or can I build a tower here?
Yeah.
Those are the things that are in Donald Trump's head, not what are our alliances? What is the shape of the world we want to see in the future? How do we respond as the lone superpower to a rising China or a Russia that's expansionist into Europe, or into the situations in the Middle East that they are clearly ping-ponging back and forth on, into an area, I think, where we may end up with a Guns of August situation where the war starts. We don't really know why.
I mean, I think the other thing that's in Trump's head is, can I get a big win? Can I have a big win that'll go down in history?
What is a win?
You know, denuclearization of North Korea, right? So he continues down this path despite all evidence, thinking, wrongly, I might add, that somehow he's going to get this, and this would be a great big deal, and he'd go down in history as the president who did it. He'll lose interest eventually, as he's lost interest in Venezuela, as he will lose interest, I think, probably in Iran, when he sees that this policy has impoverished the Iranians and frustrated them and angered them, but it hasn't made them capitulate. And so to take that next step of an actual attack or something like that, I don't think Trump wants to do that. Now, we could blunder into it. I'm very worried about
I'm worried
that
about something else, though, that, you know, and I've said many times, Trump is not beyond doing anything for his own means. A wag the dog situation, that as we get closer to an election, 6 months, 8 months, the only thing that would keep him in office is a war. And he is not beyond that, particularly when you factor in what General McCaffrey said, which is probably the scariest thing of this entire matrix, is that there's nobody home. There's Jared and Ivanka in the White House with the ball. It's Chauncey Gardner. It's being there. There's nobody home. So when you take the fact that there is no guardrails and bumpers against this guy, with his capacity to do anything, my fear is actually the opposite.
General McCaffrey, let me just read you a little more of the New York Times reporting that we started off with. David Sanger reporting that on Iran, the theory was once that he abandoned the Iran deal and reimposed sanctions, Iran would crack. But rather than crack, the Iranians escalated, leaving Mr. Trump without any easy options. As these dramas play out, no one is watching the Iran confrontation more carefully than Mr. Kim in North Korea. He's played Trump much more skillfully than the Iranians have, engaging him first in a feel-good summit meeting and then for a year rejecting the administration's definitions of denuclearization. I mean, that is in an American newspaper, but my understanding from where the intelligence community's briefings stand right now with the president is that that's a more nuanced analysis than he's even willing to receive in the PDBs, which have now been reduced to pictures and the kinds of conversations that don't agitate him. I mean, how much of a disadvantage do we have because of the president's inabilities to stitch together? And I don't say this in any sort of intellectual way, but just these are tectonic plates. Every action causes friction in another part of the world. How much of a disadvantage are we at strategically because our president isn't a consumer of information, he's not a consumer of history, and he doesn't really understand just what David Sanger points out, that he's being played?
Well, look, these are actually real issues. Trump did inherit them, the Iranian situation, North Korea, dealing with the Russians, Crimea, you name it, Venezuela. They're all real issues that require thoughtful, coordinated policy options where somebody makes a choice and then orchestrates the tools of American government. That's gone. It's not there. So I'm not quite sure the Iranians have a clue what to do. We put them in a box. The economics are getting to them. Their people are angry, not so much at Trump as at their own leadership. The Europeans are still with them, not with us, because we've insulted our allies. I actually don't see any, quote, off-ramps to this whole situation. That's the danger. And, you know, the IRGC, which got identified as a terrorist organization, is also a criminal organization, has a lot of money-making activities. They're losing money. They are capable of being a rogue actor in the Persian Gulf. So I think the potential for a guns of August kind of situation is actually there. Nobody with a right mind wants war in the Gulf, but we could end up in one.
That's a terrifying thought. Robert Costa, can I ask you to just add any of your own reporting? I mean, I think about the picture that General McCaffrey's painting on Iran, and I think about the point that's been made around this table about the influence of Jared and Ivanka in a serious way, that they are very predisposed to the kinds of foreign policy priorities of Israel, of Saudi Arabia, of UAE, which would have the president lean forward even more than maybe he wants to. Who are the influencers? Who are the people that Donald Trump is talking to, other than the hosts we can all see on Fox News?
Based on my reporting, the people who matter are the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, because they have to decide, along with the president, who makes the ultimate decision, will they give Iran any breathing room here as they deal with the sanctions? Could they cut a deal with the Japanese, with other European nations to try to expand and get some more oil revenue for Iran, especially if they're not going to deal with the United States? If there's not going to be a solution to the Iran nuclear deal, the United States has to make a decision of how is it going to really allow this pressure to continue on Iran? Can they let the air out a little bit if they can get some concessions on the Gulf of Oman and different shipping lanes in the Middle East? I mean, they're under a lot of pressure in the business community. The United States government is to protect oil reserves in Venezuela, to protect the shipping lanes in the Middle East. These are all different factors that are playing into the discussions right now in this administration.
Dicey stuff. General McCaffrey, thank you so much. I'm going to stay up at night tonight worrying based on your comments, but we're grateful to have them. After the break, when Donald Trump kicks off his re-election campaign at a rally in Florida tonight, he will do so as one of the most unpopular presidents in American history, with a longer list of broken promises than accomplishments. So what could go wrong? Also ahead, Joe Biden is talking about picking off 5 Trump states if he's the nominee, and they are all in the South, inside the changing map for Democrats. And news that Donald Trump plans to live tweet the MSNBC debates means we know he'll be watching our broadcast. But what's behind the president's obsession with the Democratic primary? We'll go inside the president's political paranoia. All those stories coming up.
Watching MSNBC International. There are all kinds of roads. Some are long and dusty.
There's no border fence.
Others paved with gold.
We're going to find out what went down in that meeting.
Gridlocked roads.
It is all about the legal battle now boiling over.
But no matter the road, when the rubber meets it, these trusted NBC News journalists will be on it.
As a guy, Trump has for years used his size and his handshake to pull people in close and off balance. So it's been theorized Macron is using the kissing and the stroking and the hand-holding as a kind of double reverse body trolling attempt to keep Trump off balance. At times during this visit, it looked like the two men could not keep their hands off of each other. Either way, we saw a bilateral rom-com.
It's a divided country, people ready to go toe-to-toe on each and every issue. Look, I like a political fight as much as anybody.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.